first, let's import our namespace system.data to the class data table. So by importing this namespace, every time we call on the data table or reference it, we don't have to specify on what is the specific namespace for it, in which it will be much more easier and concise when doing our code. Next, inside our form, we declare a variable So here, we declare a variable named table and assign it as data table. By assigning it with the data table class, we are representing it as a table, which means that we can add some rows and columns to it, and as well as adding some value inside it. After we created our table, let's proceed on adding some columns to it. Here, by calling on the table we created and using the columns that add method, we are able to add some columns into the table. So the first one is the salary ID with a get type of system32, which means that it will only accept or it will only get an integer value. And same goes for the other columns. Now for the column of the basic salary, we use the get type system.double, which means that if we input a double value to it, to that specific row, or to that specific columns rather, it will accept it. And also in the employee name, we use system.string, which means that it will get a string value to that specific column. The same concept, the other columns is applied. And lastly, the last part, by calling on the variable name or the design name of our data grid and set the variable table as data source, we are able to display the data inside the table variable. Now let's try to run the program if we are able to add some columns into the table and able to display it into the data grid. As you can see, we are able to add some columns into the table. Now, let's proceed on adding a function into the insert method. Here, as you can see, outside the function for the button, we declare a variable named last ID as integer and initialize it to the value of 0. Now this variable, we are going to use it as a counter for how many data or row of data we're able to add into the table. Inside the button function, we declare a new variable named newRow and set it as data row with the function inside the button, we create a new variable named newRow and set it as data row and initialize it as table.newRow. By using this function, we're going to be able to create a new row for our table. By using the new row method, the variable new row will represent as a new row for our table. Now next, here we set last ID plus equals to 1, which means that every time we input the value inside the table, the value of the last ID will increment, representing a counting for our records or data inside the table. Next, we call on the new row variable that we created, and inside we have a parameter salary ID and then equals to last ID. Now by adding this parameter salary ID, we are specifying that the value of the last ID will be displayed or added as a new row for the salary ID column. Same goes as for the next column, which is employee ID, which is equals to text box 2 that text, which means that whatever value we input inside text box 2, that specific value will be created as a new row under the column employee ID. Now by using this parameter, we are specifying or making sure that a specific text box or a specific value of a text box will be input or displayed under a specific column inside the table. Same flow will go to the other columns. Next, here at the basic salary column, we use double.parse, which means that every input that is inside the text box 7, we will parse it as a double value, which means that it will accept a double value, and then same goes to the other remaining rows. Here at the last part, we call on the table variable, and then we used rows that add the parameter of the variable named new row, which means that all the value that is inside the new row will be added into the table as a new row of data. And then next to it, again, we call on the data grid view 1 and set the table as its data source to be able to display all the data inside the table variable. Now let's try if the add button works. As you can see, we are able to add some values inside the table. So let's proceed on creating a function for our data grid. So here, outside the function, we declare a variable named index and set it as integer. Inside the function, we initialize the index variable into e.rowIndex. So by using it for our index variable, every time we click on a specific cell inside the data grid, it will return the index of the row of that specific cell. Now next to it, we declare a new variable named selected row and set it as data grid view row. Now we initialize selected row equals to data grid view 1 that rows, and then we use the index as the parameter. By doing so, every time we click on a specific cell inside the data grid, all the corresponding data of row inside that cell or along that cell will be displayed into the text boxes. So here, by using the select row and then using the cells function and using the index of the specific cell as the parameter of that cell's function, and then that value to string, we are able to display the values from the data grid or from the table back into the text box. So in that way, this will going to be useful on creating or updating our data inside the table. Speaking of updating, here going to create the function for our update button. Here, inside the button function, we create a new variable named new data and set it as data grid view row. So we initialize the variable new data into the value of the data grid view 1 that rows, and then using the index variable again. And the next, calling again the new data variable and then using the cells method that value equals to a specific text box. This way, we are going to be able to update the value of a specific row. So if we, like for example, we click on a specific row, the value of that specific row will be displayed back into the text box, and then after displaying it, we're now going to be able to edit it, and then by clicking the update button, the specific row of a specific cell will be updated depending on what cell you are clicking or what cell or what row you chose to update. Now we are done in update button. Let's proceed to the delete button. So here inside the delete button, we declare a new variable named row ID and set it as string, and then equals to the value of the text box 1 that text that trim. So by using the trim method, it will remove the white spaces before and after the value to avoid error. Next to it, we have a for each statement or for each condition. So the condition for the for each is for each row as data grid view row in data grid view 1 that rows, which means that it will iterate through the numbers of row inside the data grid view 1. So that depending on how many rows inside the data grid view 1, it will, or this for each statement will execute or iterate. Now inside this for each condition, we have a if condition. So if row that cells at index 0, since the parameter of the cells is 0, that value, which means the value of that cell index, the value of the cell 0 is not nothing, which means not a 0 or nothing, and also row that cells at 0 again and value, and then convert the value at the row cell 0 to string is equals to row ID, then it will execute the function or the condition below. So basically it means that if you input a value inside the text box 1, and then that value has a corresponding or has a similar value inside the data grid or inside our table, then it will execute the statement inside the if condition. So that statement is data grid view that rows that remove row. So by using the row as the parameter, which means it will going to remove the row or the index of the row that has or that is similar to the value that you input inside the text box 1. For example, you have 4 rows, then you input at the text box, you chose 2, which means it will correspond to the index row of 2, so it will remove the the row of data inside the index number 2, and after it will exit the for each loop. Now let's proceed into the search button. So inside the function of the search button, we declare a new variable named search and set it as integer, and then initialize it to the value of the text box 1, that text. Next, we declare another variable named search row as a data grid view row. Now we use search row equals into the data grid view 1 that rows, which means that it will get the specific row of data inside the data grid view 1, and then the parameter is search minus 1. So it means that on whatever value you input inside the text box, it will return the value of that specific index minus to 1 or subtracted to 1. So if you input 2, since we are talking about index, so counting of index starts from 0. So if you input 2 and then you don't subtract it by 1, then means that if you want to return the value of the row 2, so you input 2. If you don't subtract it by 1, the content of index is 0, 1, 2. So it means that it will return the third row. So in avoiding that, we subtract 1 from the search variable, so that when we want to return or search for a specific row of data, we are accurately returning the values inside that row that we want to return. So search minus 1, so it means that it will return the value of that row of data into the search row variable. Now using the text box text box 1, that text up to text box 13, that text, and then setting its value or initializing its value to search row that cell, and then the specific index that you want, and then the value of that specific cell or index will going to be get, and then convert it into string, and then return it into the text box input. So in that way, every time you search a specific row of data using the ID or the salary ID, it will display it into the text box. So it is another way also that we can also update a specific row. For example, you want to update row 2, so you just input, or ID 2, so you just input 2, and then the value inside the row number 2, all the value inside that row will be displayed back again into the text box. Then you can edit those value and then submit it or update it again. So we are done on adding the function for our salary information. So now let's continue on adding some more design to our program. Now we are done on adding some additional design to our program. Let's now try to run the program with the complete functional buttons and text box, including also the data grid. So as you have seen, all the buttons is working. The insert, the search, the delete and the update button is working, as well as the data grid view. It was able to display all the value inside the table. Then also the text box, we are able to retrieve all the value that we input inside the text box and store it into the table. So there you go, we have a working program for our salary information.